Alpha King bought a girl labeled too ugly for man, then he claimed her ruthlessly. In the dust of a winter auction, she stood alone, thin, shivering, and laughed at by every man in the street. The bids were pennies, until the richest, most feared rancher in the valley threw down gold. He didn't smile. He didn't explain. He just wrapped his coat around her shoulders and said, "She's mine now." But in a land where cattle trails cross Ute hunting grounds, nothing is simple. She carries a bloodline and a secret that could tear the valley's power apart, if she survives long enough to tell it. Behind polite smiles, men are sharpening their knives, and the one who claimed her will have to choose between his land, his life, and the girl no one wanted. This channel isn't just about stories. It's about remembering what still holds value: empathy, truth, and the courage to care. A bitter wind cut through the main street of Elkford, making weathered shop signs creak and sending dead leaves skittering across the dusty ground. The usual Saturday morning bustle had given way to an uneasy quiet as townsfolk gathered for the weekly labor auction, a practice that had grown increasingly common as drought and hard times left more children parentless and unwanted. Elsie May stood on the wooden platform, her thin arms wrapped around herself in a futile attempt to stop shivering. The recent lice outbreak at the orphanage had left her dark hair choppy and uneven, making her look even more pitiful than usual. Her worn dress, a faded hand-me-down, offered little protection against the cruel autumn wind. "Next up," the auctioneer announced, his voice carrying a note of disdain, "we have this specimen." He gestured toward Elsie with exaggerated disappointment. 14 years old, half-breed. Too ugly for man or work, if you ask me. But maybe one of you kind folks can find some use for her." He paused for effect. "Shall we start the bidding at 50 cents? A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the crowd. Some turned away, unable to watch the public humiliation of a child. Others pointed and whispered behind raised hands, their eyes cruel with judgment. 40 cents? The auctioneer tried again, his voice taking on an edge of desperation. "Surely someone needs a scullery maid?" Elsie kept her eyes fixed on her bare feet, fighting back tears. She had known this day would come. The orphanage had made it clear they wouldn't keep her past 14. But the reality was worse than any nightmare. The wind whipped harder, carrying the sound of scattered jeers from the crowd. A movement at the back of the gathering caught her attention. The crowd parted like water around a stone as Jedediah King stepped forward. Even those who had never met him knew who he was. The Alpha King, they called him, for the way he'd come to dominate the cattle trade in 3 counties. He was a giant of a man, broad-shouldered and straight-backed, with a presence that commanded attention without effort. $20 gold. His voice was quiet, but carried clearly across the suddenly silent square. The auctioneer's mouth fell open. "Mr. King, sir, did you say $20? "You heard me." Jed's boots thudded heavily on the wooden steps as he mounted the platform. Without ceremony, he shrugged off his heavy leather coat and draped it over Elsie's trembling shoulders. The warm weight of it nearly swallowed her whole. Elsie clutched the edges of the coat, breathing in the scent of leather and horses. She darted a quick glance up at her buyer, then quickly looked away. His face was weathered from sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting across vast distances. But it was his eyes themselves that startled her. They were kind, despite his fearsome reputation. Jed turned to face the crowd, his stance protective. "She's mine now," he stated evenly, the words carrying both finality and warning. His gaze swept the gathering, meeting every eye that dared to hold his look. Some of the earlier mockers shuffled their feet, suddenly finding the dirt very interesting. The auctioneer, recovering his composure, hastily banged his gavel. "Sold to Mr. Jedediah King for $20 gold." Whispers erupted as Jed guided Elsie down the steps with a gentle hand on her elbow. The crowd parted wider still, creating a clear path to where his wagon waited. "Did you see that?" The Alpha King buying an orphan? What could he want with her? $20 for that scrap of a girl." There must be some mistake. Elsie heard it all but kept her head down, letting Jed's bulk shield her from the worst of the stares. His wagon was well-maintained, but simple, pulled by two strong bay horses that stood quietly in their harness. With surprising gentleness for such large hands, Jed helped her up onto the wooden seat. She clutched his coat tighter around herself as he climbed up beside her and took the reins. The wagon wheels creaked as they started moving, the sound cutting through the continued murmur of gossip. Elsie remained rigid on the seat, uncertain and wary. She sneaked another glance at the man beside her, trying to understand why the fearsome Alpha King would spend $20 gold on a half-breed orphan no one else would take for 50 cents. They rolled past the last buildings of Elkford, the town falling away behind them as Jed guided the horses toward his vast ranch lands. Elsie had heard tales of King Ranch, thousands of acres of prime grazing land, the finest cattle herd in the territory, and a sprawling but lonely house where the Alpha King lived in solitary power. The wind continued to blow, but wrapped in Jed's coat, Elsie found herself protected from its bite for the first time that day. Still, she trembled slightly, caught between gratitude for her rescue from public humiliation and fear of what this strange purchase might mean for her future. The steady clip-clop of hooves and creak of wagon wheels filled the silence between them as they headed toward whatever fate awaited at King Ranch. The wagon rolled steadily across the open range, each bump and dip making Elsie sway in her seat. She kept her eyes fixed on the horses' bobbing heads, still wrapped in Jed's oversized coat. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the frost-touched grass, and a chill wind whistled through the wagon wheels. "Can you ride?" Jed's deep voice broke the silence, making her start slightly. "Yes, sir," Elsie mumbled, then quickly added, "A little. My father taught me before." She trailed off and Jed didn't press. After a while, he tried again. "How about cooking?" "I helped in the orphanage kitchen." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Reading?" She nodded, then realized he was watching the trail. "Yes, sir. My mother taught me." Jed grunted acknowledgement, but asked nothing more. The silence stretched between them again, broken only by the creak of leather and wood. Elsie's mind raced with questions she didn't dare voice. What kind of work would he expect? Would he be kind? Or was this just another form of servitude, bought and paid for with $20 gold? The sun was setting when they finally crested a rise overlooking King Ranch. Elsie couldn't help but stare at the sprawling property below. A large two-story ranch house stood proudly at the center, warm lamplight already glowing in its windows. To one side, a long bunkhouse showed signs of life, smoke rising from its chimney, the sounds of men's voices carrying on the evening air. Multiple corrals spread out from the main buildings, their wooden rails rimmed with frost in the failing light. As they approached, Elsie saw cattle moving in the distance, their forms dark against the purple sky. A few ranch hands tipped their hats as the wagon passed, their curious gazes lingering on her small figure beside their boss. Jed pulled the wagon to a stop near the house's front porch. Before helping Elsie down, he pointed out the basic layout: barn, tool shed, chicken coop. His voice was matter-of-fact, as though bringing home strange orphans was an everyday occurrence. Inside, the ranch house was warm and smelled of wood smoke and cooking. Jed lit a lamp in the parlor, its glow revealing worn but well-kept furniture. "Kitchen's through there," he said, nodding toward a doorway. "Clara will have supper ready." Elsie followed him to the kitchen, where a middle-aged woman stood at the stove, stirring a large pot of stew. Clara turned at their entrance, her lined face settling into a frown as she took in Elsie's ragged appearance. "Clara Bennett, this is Elsie May," Jed said simply. "She'll be staying with us." Clara's eyes narrowed slightly. "Will she now?" She looked Elsie up and down, lips pursed. "Well, girl, are you hungry?" Elsie nodded, shrinking slightly under the housekeeper's scrutiny. "Then sit." Clara pointed to the kitchen table with her wooden spoon. "And take off that coat inside, for heaven's sake." Reluctantly, Elsie slipped out of Jed's coat, feeling exposed in her thin dress. She perched on the edge of a chair while Clara ladled thick stew into bowls. Jed sat across from her, his large frame making the kitchen chair look small. "You'll have your own room upstairs," he said as they ate. "Small but private. There'll be chores, helping Clara, tending the kitchen garden, gathering eggs. Nothing too heavy." He paused, watching as her trembling hand struggled with the spoon. "We'll sort out proper clothes tomorrow." Elsie managed a few bites of the rich stew, though her stomach was tight with anxiety. Clara bustled around them, her movements sharp and efficient, occasionally casting suspicious glances in Elsie's direction. After supper, Elsie helped clear the dishes, trying to prove herself useful. Through the kitchen window, she could hear voices in the yard, two ranch hands talking in the darkness. "Only did it to get under the Crawford's skin," one was saying. "You know how they feel about mixing with Indians." "She's part Injun, all right," the other replied. "Could ruin him taking her in like this. Crawford Cattle Company won't stand for it." "Hush now," Clara's voice cut through Elsie's eavesdropping. "Those dishes won't dry themselves." Later, Clara showed her to a small room at the top of the narrow stairs. It was simple, a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a hook for clothes, but clean and warm. Elsie stood in the middle of it, hardly daring to believe it was hers. She had just changed into a nightgown Clara had found when a knock came at the door. Jed's large frame filled the doorway, but he didn't step inside. "No one harms you here," he said firmly, his eyes serious in the lamplight. "You understand?" Elsie swallowed hard, wanting to believe him despite years of learned caution. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once and closed the door, his heavy footsteps retreating down the hallway. Elsie sat on the edge of the bed, running her hands over the clean quilt. Outside, a coyote called lonely across the range, and somewhere below, she could hear Clara moving about, settling the house for the night. She was safe, for now at least, but sleep would be long in coming as she wondered what tomorrow would bring in this strange new home. Dawn painted the eastern sky in pale gold when Clara rapped sharply on Elsie's door. "Up with you, girl! Chickens won't feed themselves." Elsie hurried to dress in yesterday's clothes, following Clara's bustling form down to the kitchen. The housekeeper handed her a worn basket and led her out to the chicken coop, frost crunching under their boots. "Mind your hands," Clara instructed, demonstrating how to reach under the irritable hens. "They'll peck if you startle them." She watched as Elsie carefully gathered the first egg, her movements gentle and precise. "Well, at least you're not completely useless." Elsie worked steadily, speaking softly to each hen as she collected their eggs. By the time they finished, the basket held 24 warm eggs, and the morning sun had burned away the frost. Clara nodded with grudging approval. "Front porch needs sweeping next," she said, taking the eggs. "Brooms by the door." As Elsie swept, she felt eyes on her. Ranch hands moved between the bunkhouse and the barn, some pausing to stare openly at the strange new girl on their boss's porch. She kept her head down, pushing dirt and dead leaves off the wooden planks, but their whispers carried. "That's the Indian girl." King's lost his mind. "Crawford won't like this." Mid-morning, Jed emerged from the house in his riding clothes. He paused beside Elsie, who gripped the broom handle tighter. "Going to town for supplies," he told her. "Mind Clara while I'm gone." Elsie nodded, watching as he mounted his horse and rode out. The day stretched ahead, empty and uncertain. In town, Jed tied his horse outside the mercantile. He was examining feed prices when a shadow darkened the doorway. Luke Crawford stood there, his expensive boots and silver belt buckle marking him as the Crawford Cattle Company's foreman. "Bold move, King," Crawford said, his polite tone barely masking contempt. "Taking in that half-breed girl." Jed continued reading the price list. "Something you want, Crawford?" "Just wondering if you know what you're getting into." Crawford stepped closer, lowering his voice. "That girl's got ties to an old Ute water petition. Railroad's mighty interested in keeping certain claims buried." Jed turned slowly, his large frame towering over Crawford. "She's 14 years old." "She's trouble," Crawford snapped. "Smart man would turn her out before she brings ruin to his door." "Then I guess I'm not smart." Jed's voice was deadly quiet. "But I am clear on this. She stays under my protection. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly." Crawford's face reddened, but he stepped aside as Jed loaded his supplies. The threat hung in the air between them, unspoken but clear. Back at the ranch, Elsie had finished her morning chores. With Clara busy baking, she slipped away to explore. The tack room drew her attention. Its leather and oil smell reminded her of happier days with her father. She ran her fingers over the smooth bridles hanging in rows, traced the tooled patterns on old saddles. A soft nickering drew her to the barn door. An elderly bay mare stood in the nearest stall, her brown eyes gentle. "That's Daisy." Clara's voice made Elsie jump. "Too old for much, but giving rides to children now." The housekeeper's expression softened slightly. "You can give her an apple, if you like. There's a barrel by the door." Elsie offered the apple to Daisy, smiling as the mare's velvet lips tickled her palm. For a moment, she felt almost at peace. The sun was setting when Jed returned. He carried a wrapped package into the house, finding Elsie helping Clara with supper preparations. "Here," he said, holding out the package. "Can't have you wearing the same dress all winter." Elsie carefully unwrapped a new wool dress, simple but warm, in a deep blue color. She clutched it to her chest, unable to speak. "Go try it on before supper," Clara said, her voice gentler than it had been all day. After Elsie disappeared upstairs, Clara turned to Jed. "We need to talk." They moved to the parlor where Clara spoke in low, urgent tones. "You're stirring up trouble, taking her in. Crawford's lot won't stand for it, and they've got friends in high places." "I know." Jed's face was grim. "Do you? Because—" Clara broke off as heavy boots clattered on the porch. Tom Wilson, one of the night riders, burst in without knocking. "Boss, thought you should know. Railroad lawyers are in town. They're asking questions about the girl." Jed exchanged a sharp look with Clara. "What kind of questions?" "About her mother mostly, and something about old water rights." Tom shifted uncomfortably. "They're offering rewards for information." Above them, they could hear Elsie's light footsteps as she came back downstairs in her new dress, unaware of the gathering storm her presence had sparked. The morning sky bloomed with streaks of pink and orange as Jed led Elsie to the barn. Daisy stood drowsily in her stall, her bay coat gleaming from a recent brushing. To Elsie's surprise, Jed didn't reach for a saddle. "Today you learned to ride bareback," he said, bringing over a simple rope halter. "It'll help you feel the horse better." Elsie's eyes widened. "Without a saddle?" "Best way to learn." Jed demonstrated how to secure the halter, his large hands moving with surprising gentleness. "Your mother's people rode this way. Balance comes from your legs, not the saddle." He helped boost her onto Daisy's broad back. The mare's warmth seeped through Elsie's dress, and she gripped the rope nervously. "Relax your legs," Jed instructed, leading Daisy in a slow circle. "Let them hang natural. That's it." They practiced in the corral until Elsie found her seat. Soon she was guiding Daisy with just shifts of her weight and gentle tugs on the rope. Jed mounted his own horse, a tall black gelding, and they set out toward the creek pasture. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and pine from the distant mountains. Daisy's steady gait grew more comfortable with each step. They followed a winding trail down to where the creek cut through grazing land, its waters dancing with early sunlight. Daisy waded into a shallow section, splashing playfully. The cold water sprayed Elsie's legs, and a laugh burst from her throat, bright and unexpected. It was the first time she'd laughed since coming to the ranch. Jed glanced over, a slight smile softening his usually stern face. They rode the fence line, Jed pointing out weak spots that needed mending. Elsie absorbed everything, grateful for the simple peace of the morning. But as they approached the ranch on their return, she noticed a figure sitting beside the gate. It was an elderly native woman, wrapped in a faded blanket decorated with geometric patterns. Deep lines marked her weathered face, and her silver hair was braided with red cloth woven through it. She stood as they approached, leaning on a gnarled walking stick. "Nad'ani," Jed greeted her with clear respect, dismounting. "You honor us with your visit." The woman's dark eyes fixed on Elsie. "So, Sarah's daughter has come home." Elsie's breath caught. "You knew my mother?" "Come inside," Jed said, helping Elsie down from Daisy. "Clara will have coffee ready." In the kitchen, Clara set out cups and fresh bread, treating Natani with careful deference. The old woman settled in a chair, her blanket wrapped tight despite the warm room. Your mother saved this man's life, she said to Elsie, gesturing at Jed. When he was young and foolish, trying to cross the creek during spring floods. Elsie turned to Jed, who nodded. I was 17, thought I knew everything. My horse spooked at lightning, threw me in. Sarah was gathering willow branches nearby. She jumped in after me, got me to shore. She was strong, your mother, Natani continued. Strong in body and spirit. The petition she filed for grazing and water rights along the old tribal lands, it still lives. The railroad men want it buried, forgotten. They will try to shame you, break you, keep the claim silent. Clara inhaled sharply, but Jed's face remained impassive. Elsie's hands trembled around her coffee cup. Why? She whispered. What's in the petition? Truth, Nut Ani replied. About the land, the water, promises made and broken. Truth that could stop their plans for the new rail line. She rose, leaning on her stick. I must go before sunset, but I will return. Jed walked her to her waiting pony. When he came back, the kitchen was silent except for Clara's worried puttering with the dishes. That evening, after Clara had gone to bed, Jed found Elsie sitting by the parlor fire. He settled into his chair, studying the flames. I should have told you about your mother before, he said quietly. About the flood. I was young, stupid, showing off for some ranch hands by trying to cross during a storm. The water was already too high. His voice grew tender with memory. Sarah came out of nowhere. She didn't hesitate, just dove in after me, got a rope around me somehow, pulled me to shore. By the time we made it to the bank, we were half drowned, but she just laughed, said I needed to learn respect for the water spirits. Elsie watched his face in the firelight, seeing the softness there that his usual stern expression hid. Why didn't you tell me when you first saw me? At the auction? Wasn't sure you'd want to hear it then. Wasn't sure you'd trust anything I said. He met her eyes. But I recognized you. You have her look about you. Same quiet strength. Long after she went to bed, Elsie lay awake, turning his words over in her mind. Her mother, brave enough to leap into floodwaters, strong enough to file a petition that still frightened powerful men, and Jed, who'd known this all along, who'd claimed her at auction for reasons deeper than mere charity. Sleep was slow to come as she wondered what other secrets lay buried in her mother's past, and what storms those secrets might yet bring to her door. The days settled into a gentle rhythm at the King Ranch. Each morning, Elsie woke to the sound of Clara stoking the kitchen fire and the distant lowing of cattle. She found comfort in the small tasks that filled her hours, though whispers of trouble from town drifted in like autumn leaves. In the warm kitchen, Elsie sat cross-legged by the hearth, a pile of work shirts in her lap. Her needle flashed in the firelight as she mended tears and replaced worn buttons. Clara worked nearby at the butter churn, the steady thump splash marking time as morning stretched toward noon. You've got a neat hand with those stitches, Clara observed, wiping her brow. Where did you learn? The orphanage, Elsie replied softly. Sister Mary Margaret said idle hands were the devil's workshop. She smoothed a finished shirt, remembering long hours bent over endless mending. Later that afternoon, Jed took her to check the winter hay stores. They rode side by side, Elsie now comfortable on Daisy's bare back. The hay barn stood solid against the gray sky, its weathered boards holding sweet-smelling feed that would see the cattle through the cold months ahead. Looking good, Jed noted as they counted the stacked bales. Might even have extra to sell come spring. Sunday arrived crisp and clear. Elsie wore her best dress, the new wool one Jed had bought her, though she tugged nervously at its sleeves as they approached the white-painted church. Jed guided her firmly toward a pew near the front, his hand steady at her elbow. The whispers started immediately. Bold as brass, bringing her right up front, someone muttered. What's he thinking? Came another voice. Elsie kept her eyes forward, focusing on the cross above the altar. Jed sat straight-backed beside her, his presence like a shield. After the service, people filed past to shake the preacher's hand. When Elsie's turn came, the man hesitated, his smile stiff. We must all, Keep the peace in these trying times, he murmured, barely touching her offered hand before turning to the next person. Outside on the church steps, a cluster of girls in fine Sunday dresses pointed and giggled. One whispered loud enough to carry, "Look at those patches!" Like wearing a quilt to church? Elsie felt Jed tense beside her, but she touched his arm lightly. The drive home was quiet until they turned onto the ranch road. "Mr. King?" Elsie spoke up. "Maybe I could help more in the barn instead of going to town so much. The horses need extra care in winter." Jed's hands tightened on the reins. "You've done nothing to be ashamed of, Elsie. Nothing to hide from." That evening, as Clara served up a hearty beef stew, Jed cleared his throat. "Been thinking we need something to lift the winter gloom around here." Clara set down her spoon, eyeing him suspiciously. "Oh, time for a barn dance," he announced. "Next Saturday, Elsie will be hostess." Clara's eyebrows shot up. "A dance with all that's brewing? You'll draw the very folks stirring up trouble?" "Then let them come," Jed said firmly, meeting Elsie's startled gaze across the table. "Let them see exactly where I stand." Elsie's spoon trembled slightly against her bowl. A barn dance meant more eyes, more whispers, more chances for those who opposed her presence to make their feelings known. But Jed's expression was set, determined to make his support public and unmistakable. "We'll need extra lanterns," Clara said after a moment, practical as always. "And the barn floor will want sweeping. Might as well do it proper." "I can help," Elsie offered quietly. "I know how to make paper chains for decorating." Jed nodded, satisfaction clear in his face. "Good. We'll show them how the King Ranch celebrates." Later, as Elsie lay in bed listening to the wind whistle through bare tree branches, she thought about the coming dance. Her stomach churned with equal parts dread and determination. Jed was forcing the issue, refusing to let her hide in the shadows. She would have to stand beside him, greet guests, face their judgment head-on. She turned her face into the pillow, remembering the preacher's reluctant handshake, the girls' cruel laughter. But then she recalled Jed's words at supper. "Let them see where I stand." He wasn't just offering protection, he was declaring her place here, making it official before the whole community. Sleep came slowly that night, her mind full of dancing shadows and lamplight, of music and judgment, of a chance to either shrink away or stand tall. Tomorrow they would begin preparations, transforming the barn into a gathering place where her new life would be put on display for all to see. The day before the dance dawned bright and cold. The kitchen hummed with activity as Clara and Elsie worked side by side, rolling out pie crusts and peeling mountains of apples. Sweet cinnamon and sugar scented the air while wood smoke curled from the stove. "6 pies might not be enough," Clara fretted, wiping flour from her hands. "Folks come hungry to these dances." "We could make another apple and maybe a berry," Elsie suggested, carefully crimping a crust edge the way Clara had shown her. Outside, the sound of hammering and men's voices drifted from the barn. Ranch hands were clearing the floor, pushing hay bales against the walls to make room for dancing. Elsie watched through the window as they hung ropes of evergreen branches and strung lanterns from the rafters. "Those boys better sweep that floor proper," Clara muttered. "Can't have ladies tripping over splinters." By mid-afternoon, Elsie's arms ached from rolling dough and hanging paper chains. She was just helping Clara arrange the cooling pies when a shadow fell across the kitchen doorway. There stood Nat Ani, her silver hair gleaming in the winter sun. "Child," the elderly woman called softly, beckoning Elsie outside. In her arms, she carried a bundle wrapped in faded cloth. Elsie stepped onto the porch, curious. Natani unwrapped the package with careful hands, revealing a shawl that took Elsie's breath away. Delicate beadwork caught the light, creating patterns like flowing water across the deep blue fabric. "Your mother wore this," Natani said, holding it out. "At her own first dance. It should be yours now." Elsie's fingers trembled as she touched the soft wool. "It's beautiful," she whispered, memories of her mother stirring like autumn leaves. "Wear it tomorrow," Natani instructed. "Show them who you are, both sides of your blood. Be proud." When evening came the next day, Wagons began arriving in a steady stream. Lantern light danced across the snow as families made their way to the barn. Fiddle music spilled into the night, mixing with laughter and the stamp of boots. In her room, Elsie stood before the small mirror, hardly recognizing herself. The new wool dress fit perfectly, its deep green color making her eyes seem brighter. Clara had helped her braid her growing hair into a crown around her head. The beaded shawl draped her shoulders like a blessing. A knock came at her door. "Ready?" Jed asked. Elsie took a deep breath and opened the door. Jed stood there in his best shirt and vest, his expression softening as he saw her. "You look fine, Miss King," he said quietly. "Shall we?" They walked together to the barn, conversations hushed as they entered, heads turning to watch their progress. Elsie felt her cheeks warm under the scrutiny, but Jed's steady presence beside her gave her courage. The fiddlers struck up a lively tune. Without hesitation, Jed led her onto the cleared floor for the first dance. Other couples joined them, and soon the barn was full of swirling skirts and clicking boots. Between dances, Jed made a point of introducing her to each neighbor. "This is Miss Elsie King," he would say firmly, making the name a declaration. Some still gave cool nods, but others offered genuine smiles and welcome. A young cowboy from the Morrison Ranch approached shyly. "Might I have this waltz, Miss King?" Elsie glanced at Jed, who nodded encouragingly. The cowboy proved to be a good dancer, careful not to step on her toes. They shared a laugh when he admitted it was his sister who had taught him. As the evening wore on, Elsie found herself relaxing. She danced with several more partners, accepted compliments on the pies, and even joined a group of women discussing winter preserves. The beaded shawl drew admiring glances, and when she explained its history, she saw respect replace judgment in some eyes. Near midnight, Jed called for attention over the music. "I want to thank you all for coming," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner. "And special thanks to our hostess. Miss King's done this ranch proud. She's a finer hostess than I deserve." Applause followed his words. Elsie ducked her head, overwhelmed by the moment. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, she felt truly seen, not as an orphan or an outcast, but as herself. The last wagon departed close to midnight, bells jingling in the cold air. Elsie helped Clara collect pie plates and blow out lanterns, her feet still keeping time to phantom fiddle music. When she finally climbed the stairs to her room, exhaustion and joy mingled in her bones. She carefully folded her mother's shawl, running her fingers over the beadwork one last time. The smell of pine branches and wood smoke clung to the wool. As she drifted off to sleep, a smile played across her face, remembering the warmth of acceptance that had filled the barn like lamplight. The morning after the barn dance broke cold and clear, frost glittering on the window panes. Elsie was helping Clara set the breakfast table when the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Through the kitchen window, they watched two well-dressed men ride up to the ranch house, their polished boots and tailored coats marking them as city folk rather than ranchers. Clara's hands stilled on the plates. "Trouble," she muttered, recognizing the Crawford lawyer's sleek bay horse. Jed emerged from his study, adjusting his vest. He strode out to meet the visitors in the yard, his shoulders set in a rigid line. Elsie crept closer to the window, heart pounding as she recognized Thomas Keene, the railroad agent, dismounting alongside the Crawford lawyer. "King," Keene called out with false warmth, removing his leather gloves. "Lovely morning for a chat about water rights." "Say your piece," Jed replied, his voice carrying through the crisp air. The Crawford lawyer reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a leather document folder. "We've uncovered some interesting paperwork regarding the wellspring that feeds your ranch." He extracted a yellow deed, holding it up to catch the morning light. "According to these records, that water source sits on railroad property." Elsie's stomach clenched. She knew that spring. It bubbled up from deep underground near the western pasture, feeding the creek that sustained the ranch's cattle through summer and winter alike. "That deed's about as genuine as a $3 bill," Jed said evenly. "My father purchased those water rights legal and proper 30 years ago." Keene's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Perhaps we could reach an arrangement. The railroad is willing to overlook this matter entirely." He paused, gaze sliding toward the house. "Provided you remove certain complications from the equation." "The girl goes, the water stays," the lawyer added bluntly. "Simple as that." Clara's hand found Elsie's shoulder, squeezing gently. Through the window, they watched Jed's face darken like an approaching storm. "Get off my land," he said, voice deadly quiet, "and take your forged papers with you." "Consider carefully, King," Keen warned, replacing his gloves with deliberate movements. "You're choosing a very costly path." "I've considered. Now, ride out." The lawyer tucked the deed away, mounting his horse with a cold smile. "You'll regret this decision, King. Count on it." They wheeled their horses around and rode out, kicking up frost as they went. Jed watched until they disappeared down the road before turning back to the house. His boots struck the wooden floor hard as he paced the kitchen, jaw working. "What will we do?" Clara asked, breaking the tense silence. "Ride into town tomorrow," Jed said finally, running a hand through his hair. "Need to speak with the county clerk, see those original water deeds myself." He stopped pacing, looking at Elsie. "Should be records of your mother's petition there, too." Elsie stared down at her hands, twisted in her apron. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never meant to bring such trouble to your door." "Look at me, girl," Jed said firmly. When she raised her eyes, his expression was fierce but kind. "This isn't your doing. Some things are worth defending no matter the cost. What's right is right." Clara began setting out breakfast, the familiar routine somehow comforting in the face of such threats. They had just finished their morning meal when hoofbeats announced another arrival. This time, it was young Tommy from the bunkhouse, riding hard from town. "Mr. King," he called, swinging down from his lathered horse. "Got word from Pete at the Mercantile. Crawford men been making rounds, warning shopkeepers not to sell to King Ranch hands." The boy caught his breath. "Pete says they're threatening to cut credit lines for anyone who trades with us." Jed stood in the doorway, expression grim as he considered this news. Winter was far from over, and while the ranch's storeroom was well stocked, supplies would eventually run low. Crawford was striking at them through the town's merchants, a clever move that could slowly strangle the ranch's resources. As evening settled in, they gathered around the fire in the main room. Clara darned socks by lamplight while Jed stared into the flames, lost in thought. Elsie watched the shadows dance across his face, seeing the weight of the day's threats in the tight lines around his mouth. "Maybe if I left?" she began softly. "No," Jed cut her off, not looking away from the fire. "That's exactly what they want, to use you as a lever against what's right and legal. We'll find another way." He fell silent again, calculating his next move in this dangerous game of power and water rights. The fire crackled, throwing sparks up the chimney into the cold night, while outside, the wind whispered of harder times to come. Morning dawned steel gray and bitter, the kind of winter day that made even hardy ranch hands huddle closer to the stove. Elsie pulled her woolen shawl tight as she climbed into the wagon beside Jed, watching their breath cloud in the pale light. The previous day's threats hung heavy between them as they set out for town, the wagon wheels creaking through patches of frozen mud. Jed handled the reins with practiced ease, though Elsie noticed his knuckles were white with tension. They rode in silence, both lost in thought about what they might find, or not find, in the county records. The town emerged slowly through the morning haze, shop windows still dark and streets nearly empty in the early hour. They hitched the wagon outside the courthouse, an imposing brick building that made Elsie feel small. Inside, the county clerk's office smelled of dust and old paper. Herbert Mills, the clerk, jumped slightly when they entered, his round spectacles fogging up as he nervously adjusted his bow tie. "Mr. King?" he stammered, shuffling papers on his desk. "I wasn't expecting— that is, how may I assist you today?" "Need to see the original water rights survey," Jed said firmly. "The one filed 30 years back, showing the wellspring boundaries." Mills's hands fluttered like startled birds. "Oh dear, oh dear. I'm afraid there's been a most unfortunate development." He began opening drawers, though his movements suggested he already knew what they wouldn't find. "The survey documents appear to be temporarily misplaced." "Misplaced?" Jed's voice was dangerously quiet. The clerk wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. Missing, actually. I discovered it yesterday afternoon. The whole folder. Gone. His eyes darted between them. I've looked everywhere. Someone must have, that is to say. Stolen, Jed finished flatly. Mills nodded miserably. I'm so sorry, Mr. King. I've always run a careful office, but lately there's been pressure from certain parties. He trailed off, glancing fearfully at the door. Elsie watched Jed's jaw clench. Without those documents, they had no legal proof of the water rights. The railroad's false deed would stand unopposed. They emerged from the courthouse into strengthening daylight, but their path along the boardwalk was suddenly blocked by Luke Crawford. He lounged against a post, seeming to have waited for this moment. Well, if it isn't the great Jedediah King, Crawford drawled, his polished boots crossed at the ankle. His gaze slid dismissively over Elsie. And his little half-breed charity case. Jed stepped slightly in front of Elsie. Move aside, Crawford. You know, Crawford continued as if Jed hadn't spoken. It's a shame to see a respected rancher throw everything away over muddy blood. His smile was sharp as a knife. But that's what'll happen, King. Everything you've built, everything you own, gone. All because you couldn't see sense about one worthless girl. Elsie saw the muscle jump in Jed's jaw, saw his hands curl into fists at his sides. But he simply placed a steady hand on her shoulder and guided her around Crawford, not dignifying the threats with a response. As they passed, Crawford's words followed them down the boardwalk. Time's running out, King! The ride home was tense, the wagon wheels striking harder against the frozen ground. Elsie wanted to apologize again, to offer to leave. But one look at Jed's set expression told her it would be useless. He had made his choice, and he would stand by it. Evening brought a gathering in the ranch house study. Jed sat behind his desk, facing his foreman Sam Tucker and two of his most trusted hands, brothers Mike and Joe Bailey. The lamp cast long shadows as they discussed contingency plans. If they cut us off from the wellspring, Sam was saying, we could haul water from Cottonwood Creek. It's a good 10 miles, but the water runs clean there. 10 miles in winter? Mike shook his head. That's hard riding with full barrels. Horses won't last long at that pace. Might not have a choice, Joe added grimly. Cattle need water. Weather be damned. Elsie stood in the doorway, unnoticed, listening as they debated routes and schedules. The reality of what they faced settled cold in her stomach. Hauling water through winter storms would exhaust both men and horses. Some cattle would likely be lost, unable to make the trek to distant water sources. Later that night, alone in her room, Elsie pulled out the beaded shawl Nat Ani had given her. The firelight caught the intricate patterns, making them seem to dance. She remembered the old woman's words about the beadwork holding stories of water paths. Running her fingers over the designs, Elsie traced what might be creek beds and springs, wondering if these ancient patterns could hold answers they desperately needed. The wind picked up outside, rattling her window shutters with increasing force. She shivered, knowing the sound heralded an approaching storm, as both in weather and in the troubles gathering around them. The beads felt warm under her touch as she studied them more closely, trying to make sense of their arrangement. Were these lines marking hidden springs, ancient water courses? She wished she could ask her mother about their meaning, about the petition that now seemed to be at the heart of everything. A particularly strong gust shook the entire house, making the lamp flame flutter. Tomorrow would bring snow, she was certain, and with it, perhaps, the first real test of their resolve against Crawford's threats. Snow began falling before dawn, thick flakes that muffled the world in white silence. By mid-morning, the storm had intensified, and Elsie watched from the kitchen window as ranch hands struggled to clear paths between the house and barn. The animals needed constant access to water now. If the well froze, they'd lose everything. A dark shape emerged from the swirling snow, and Elsie recognized Natani's distinctive silhouette on horseback. The elderly woman's mare picked her way carefully through the drifts to the front porch. Jed came in from checking the well, snow dusting his broad shoulders, just as Natani knocked. The spirits are restless, Natani said as she entered, refusing to remove her heavy wool blanket. Her eyes found Elsie immediately. There is something you must know about your mother's petition? Clara brought coffee, and they gathered around the kitchen table. Steam rose from their cups as Nat Ani spoke, her voice low and urgent. "My people keep one copy of the treaty at the agency office, 2 days' ride north," she explained. "The superintendent there, he is a careful man. He will release it only to someone of direct bloodline." Her dark eyes fixed on Elsie. "Only to you." Jed set his cup down hard enough to slosh coffee onto the table. "You can't be serious. Look at that weather. She's 14 years old. I won't send her out in this." "The choice must be hers," Nat Ani said calmly. "The paper shows the true boundaries, marked by your mother's hand, Elsie. Without it, the railroad's false deed will stand." Elsie's hands trembled slightly as she wrapped them around her coffee cup. Through the window, she could see the snow falling harder, erasing the world in white. But she thought of Jed's kindness, of the ranch hands who would suffer hauling water, of the cattle that might die. "I'll go," she said quietly but firmly. "Elsie?" Jed started to protest. "I can do this." She met his concerned gaze. "I have to try, for everyone here." Natani nodded approvingly. "We leave at first light tomorrow. The storm will pass by then, though the cold remains." That evening, Clara helped Elsie pack warm clothes and dried food while Jed paced the kitchen, clearly unhappy with the plan. But he didn't try to stop her again. Instead, he brought out a heavy wool cloak lined with fur. "Was my mother's," he said gruffly. "Keep you warmer than that thin shawl." Before dawn the next morning, Elsie stood in the pale gray light as ranch hands saddled Daisy for her. The old mare was steady and sure-footed. She'd need both qualities for the journey ahead. Natani arrived on her paint horse, already wrapped in her thick blanket. Jed helped Elsie mount, his hands lingering on her arm. 2 days there, 2 days back, he said. "If you're not home by then." "I will be," Elsie promised, though her stomach churned with nervous energy. They set out as the sun tried to break through heavy clouds. The snow had stopped, but drifts reached past the horse's knees in places. Elsie kept Daisy close behind Natani's mare, following the older woman's tracks. The cold bit through her layers despite the fur-lined cloak, but she didn't complain. They rode in silence most of the morning, focusing on keeping the horses steady in the deep snow. Around midday, they stopped in a small grove of pines to rest the animals and eat some dried meat and bread. Elsie's legs ached from gripping Daisy's sides, unused to such long hours in the saddle. "Your mother was a fine rider," Nat Ani said as they rested. "She could track game for days without tiring. The strength is in your blood, too." They pressed on through the afternoon, the sky remaining stubbornly gray. As darkness approached, Natani led them to an old trapper's cabin she knew. The rough log structure was cold and musty, but its walls blocked the wind, and the stone fireplace still worked. While Natani tended to the horses, Elsie got a small fire going with supplies stored in the cabin. Soon, the single room filled with warmth and the smell of coffee brewing in Natani's battered pot. They sat close to the fire, wrapped in blankets. Outside, the horses stomped occasionally in the lean-to shelter, but otherwise, the night was silent with snow. "Tell me about my mother," Elsie said softly. "What was she like when she was young?" Natani's weathered face softened in the firelight. "She was like wind through summer grass, quick to laugh, quick to move. But she saw clearly, too. She knew the value of the water rights, knew they must be protected." She sipped her coffee. "The day she saved young Jed from the flood, she was tracking elk, heard his horse screaming over the rush of water. Most would have run from such danger, but your mother, she rode straight in." Elsie tried to picture it. Her mother, young and brave, plunging into raging water to save a stranger. "Why didn't Jed ever tell me?" "Some memories cut deep," Natani said. "Perhaps he waited for the right time. Or perhaps the debt weighed too heavy to speak of easily." Back at the ranch, Jed worked through the bitter night, checking the well every hour. The water wanted to freeze where it met the air. He and the hands took turns breaking the ice, keeping the flow moving. His thoughts kept straying to Elsie, out in this killing cold with only an old woman for protection. He paused at the well, staring north into the darkness. The snow had stopped, but the cold was getting worse. Every instinct screamed at him to ride after them, bring Elsie home where it was safe. But he knew she had to make this journey, not just for the ranch, but for herself, to claim her mother's legacy, and with it, her own place in this harsh land. Still, as he broke another layer of ice from the well, he whispered a prayer into the frozen night. Keep her safe. Bring her home. Dawn broke pale and threatening on their second day of travel. Elsie woke stiff from sleeping on the hard cabin floor, her muscles protesting as she helped Natani ready the horses. They ate a quick breakfast of dried meat and hard biscuits before mounting up. The snow started falling again within the first hour of their ride. Unlike yesterday's heavy flakes, these were small and sharp, driven by a cutting wind that seemed to find every gap in Elsie's clothing, despite the fur-lined cloak. She pulled her mother's beaded shawl tighter around her shoulders beneath it, grateful for the extra layer. Stay close, Natani called back through the thickening snow. The trail is harder to find now. Elsie urged Daisy forward, keeping the paint horse's dark tail in sight. The old mare plodded steadily through deepening drifts, but their progress was slower than the day before. The wind grew stronger as morning wore into afternoon, whipping snow into white curtains that obscured everything beyond a few feet. Several times, Natani had to stop and study the landscape, searching for familiar landmarks through the storm. Elsie's face burned from the cold, and her fingers felt wooden despite her thick mittens. Still, she didn't complain, remembering what Natani had said about her mother's strength. The short winter day was already fading when they finally spotted the agency buildings, dark shapes emerging from the whirling snow. Elsie's heart leaped at the sight of actual structures after so many hours in the empty white wilderness. Lamplight glowed in a few windows, promising warmth inside. They led their exhausted horses to the stable first, where a young Ute stable hand helped them remove ice-crusted tack and brush down the shivering animals. Frost had formed in both women's hair, and Elsie's legs trembled as she walked toward the main office building. The agency superintendent was still at his desk despite the late hour. He was a tall man, with iron gray hair and wire-rimmed spectacles. His manner stern, but not unkind as he looked up from his paperwork. His office smelled of tobacco and wood smoke from the pot-bellied stove in the corner. Superintendent Davies, Natani said formally. This is Elsie May, daughter of Sarah Whitehorse. The superintendent studied Elsie carefully, taking in her features. So, you're Sarah's girl, he said finally. I remember when she filed that petition, caused quite a stir at the time. Elsie's throat felt dry. Yes, sir. I've come about the treaty, the one showing the true water boundaries. He nodded slowly, still watching her face as if searching for something. His eyes dropped to the beaded shawl she wore, recognition flickering in his expression. That's Sarah's work, isn't it? I'd know those patterns anywhere. It was my mother's, yes, sir, Elsie replied. The superintendent stood and walked to a large iron safe in the corner. The combination lock clicked softly as he turned it, and the heavy door swung open with a creak. From inside, he removed a leather-bound document, its pages yellow with age, sealed with a brass army insignia. The original treaty, he explained, returning to his desk, complete with surveys and water rights documentation. He opened a thick ledger. I'll need you to sign for it. This document doesn't leave my custody without proper recording. Elsie's hands shook slightly as she took the offered pen. She carefully signed her name in the ledger, Elsie May Whitehorse. The superintendent watched her write, then nodded in satisfaction. Your mother's petition is attached inside, he said, handing her the leather folder. Keep it safe. There are powerful men who'd rather these boundaries stayed buried. Thank you, sir, Elsie said, clutching the precious document to her chest. Outside, the storm had settled into steady snowfall. The superintendent arranged for them to stay in the agency bunkhouse, a long, low building kept warm for visiting tribal members. Inside, they found several other travelers already sheltering from the weather, including a Ute woman stirring a pot of venison stew over the fireplace. The woman ladled out generous portions for Elsie and Natani, the rich smell making Elsie's stomach growl. They ate gratefully, letting the warm food chase away the last of the day's bone-deep chill. The other travelers shared news of conditions on various trails, all agreeing another big storm was moving in. Later, lying on her narrow bunk, Elsie held the treaty folder close. Its weight felt both reassuring and terrifying. This simple collection of papers could save Jed's ranch, but only if they made it back through the gathering storm. Around her, the bunkhouse creaked in the wind, and other travelers snored softly. She thought of Jed, imagining him checking the well through the frozen nights, keeping the water flowing. Had the railroad men made good on their threats yet? Were supplies running low? The questions chased themselves through her mind, making sleep impossible despite her exhaustion. Before first light, Elsie woke to Natani gently shaking her shoulder. "We must go now," the older woman whispered. "Try to get ahead of the storm." They ate quickly and thanked their hosts. Outside, the pre-dawn air bit sharply, and heavy clouds promised more snow. The stable hand had their horses ready, looking better for the night's rest and shelter. Elsie secured the treaty folder inside her cloak, close to her body where it would stay dry. As they mounted up, the superintendent appeared from his office. "Safe journey," he called. "And Elsie, your mother would be proud. She always said that land's truth would surface through her children." Elsie blinked back sudden tears as she nudged Daisy into motion. They rode out into the gray morning, leaving the agency behind. The wind was rising again, carrying the first flakes of new snow. By midday, the weak winter sun disappeared behind thick clouds that raced across the sky. The wind picked up steadily until it howled through the trees, driving needles of snow and ice before it. Elsie hunched lower in her saddle, trying to shield her face from the biting cold. Beside her, Natani rode with the same determined silence they'd maintained since leaving the agency. They approached a creek crossing, its banks crusted with ice and snow. In summer, this would be an easy ford, but now frozen patches made the footing treacherous. Natani went first, her paint horse picking its way carefully through the shallow water. Halfway across, everything happened at once. The paint's hoof struck a hidden patch of ice. The horse lost its footing, scrambling to regain balance. Natani tried to hold on, but the sudden sideways lurch threw her from the saddle. She hit the icy water with a splash and a sharp cry. "Natani!" Elsie kicked Daisy forward without thinking. The old mare, steady as always, stepped carefully to where Natani struggled in the freezing creek. Elsie leaned down, grabbing Natani's arm. The older woman's fingers were already stiff with cold as they gripped Elsie's wrist. Together, they managed to get her upright and onto Daisy's back behind Elsie. The paint horse, recovered from its slip, stood trembling nearby. "We need to get you warm," Elsie said, feeling Natani shiver violently against her back. "The trapper's cabin isn't far." They rode double on Daisy, leading the paint horse. Natani's wet clothes began to freeze in the bitter wind. Her shivering grew worse, then worryingly less severe. By the time they spotted the crude log cabin, she could barely hold on. Inside the abandoned shelter, Elsie worked quickly. She got a fire going in the stone fireplace using stored wood and the flint and steel she'd learned to carry. She helped Natani out of her frozen outer clothes and wrapped her in both their dry blankets near the growing flames. "You're as capable as your mother," Natani said through chattering teeth. "She would have done the same." Elsie melted snow for hot tea, adding dried herbs from Natani's medicine pouch. The older woman sipped it slowly, but her usual strength seemed sapped by the cold. As evening drew in, her breathing grew labored and a deep cough settled in her chest. "You must go on alone tomorrow," Natani said as they shared a meager supper of dried meat. "The treaty must reach Jed before the Crawfords can stop it." "I can't leave you here," Elsie protested. "You're too weak." Natani's dark eyes were fierce despite her illness. "I will only slow you down. The Crawfords' men will be watching the trails by now. One rider might slip past them. Two cannot." Elsie stared into the fire, knowing she was right but hating the choice. "I'll send help back for you as soon as I reach the ranch." "I know you will." Natani managed a small smile. "You have your mother's loyal heart." They spent an uneasy night in the cabin. Natani's cough grew worse, and Elsie slept fitfully, worried about both her friend's health and the journey ahead. The treaty papers, still secure inside her clothes, seemed to weigh heavily against her chest. Dawn came clear and brutally cold. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline sky and temperatures that made every breath sting. Elsie checked that Daisy's tack was secure, while Nataani gave her final instructions. "Stay off the main trails," the older woman advised, her voice hoarse. "The Crawfords will watch those first. Take the High Canyon route. It's longer but safer." Elsie mounted up, the treaty safely stowed inside her coat. "I'll send someone back within 2 days," she promised. "Keep the fire going." Nataani nodded, wrapped in both blankets despite Elsie's attempts to leave one. "Ride fast and trust your horse. Your mother watches over you." The morning sun cast long shadows as Elsie urged Daisy away from the cabin. The mare's hooves crunched through fresh snow, her breath steaming in the frigid air. Elsie kept to the tree line where possible, remembering Natani's warnings about being seen. The cold was intense, seeming to steal the very air from her lungs. She maintained a steady pace, pushing Daisy as much as she dared given the treacherous footing. The treaty papers crinkled against her ribs when she moved, reminding her of everything at stake. They climbed steadily through the morning, working their way up toward the canyon rim. From there, she could cut across country toward the King Ranch, avoiding the watched roads in the valley. Daisy was breathing hard from the effort, but the sturdy mare kept going without complaint. At the ranch miles away, a breathless ranch hand burst into the barn where Jed was checking his saddle. "Boss, Jimmy just rode in. Says he spotted the girl riding alone near Eagle Canyon." Jed's head snapped up. "Alone? Where's Nataani?" "Jimmy didn't see her. Said the girl was pushing hard toward home, but there were Crawford men in the area too." Jed was already swinging onto his horse. "Get word to the line shacks," he ordered. "I want every hand we can spare watching those trails. No one touches that girl." He rode out at a gallop, the ranch hand's voice fading behind him as he shouted orders to the others. The morning sun glinted off the snow, and somewhere ahead, Elsie was riding alone with the very document that could save or destroy everything. The winter sun hung low in the afternoon sky as Elsie guided Daisy along the narrow canyon trail. Her muscles ached from hours of riding, and the cold had settled deep in her bones despite the protection of her coat. The treaty papers crinkled softly against her chest with each step of her horse. The canyon walls rose steep and unforgiving on either side, leaving only a narrow path forward. Fresh snow crunched under Daisy's hooves, the sound echoing off the rock faces. Elsie kept alert, remembering Nataani's warnings about watching the trails. Rounding a sharp bend, Elsie pulled Daisy to a sudden halt. 2 riders sat their horses directly in her path, blocking the narrow pass. She recognized their Crawford Ranch brand on the saddles. The larger man, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, spoke first. "Well, look what we found." His voice carried a cruel edge. "The half-breed girl, riding all alone." The second rider shifted his horse closer. "Hand over that paper you're carrying, girl. We know you got it from the agency." Elsie's heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "I don't have anything for you." "Don't play stupid," the first man growled. "That treaty you're hiding, give it here and maybe we'll let you ride away in one piece." Elsie's fingers tightened on the reins. Daisy sensed her tension, dancing nervously beneath her. The canyon walls seemed to close in, leaving no path around the men. But behind them, the trail opened into wider country. If she could just get past. "Last chance," the second rider warned, his hand moving toward his gun. In that split second, Elsie made her choice. She dug her heels into Daisy's sides and snapped the reins. The old mare lunged forward, catching the Crawford men by surprise. Elsie bent low over Daisy's neck as they charged between the startled horses. A shot cracked through the canyon. White-hot pain blazed across Elsie's upper arm, but she didn't slow. She could hear shouts and pounding hooves behind her as the men gave chase. Daisy ran full out, her years of sure-footedness keeping them from disaster on the treacherous trail. Another shot echoed off the canyon walls, going wide. Elsie pressed herself flatter against Daisy's neck, one hand clutching the precious treaty through her coat. The wind stung tears from her eyes as they galloped around another bend in the trail. Suddenly, a familiar figure appeared ahead. Jed, sitting tall on his black stallion, revolver already drawn. His face was like thundercloud as he took in the scene. The pursuing hoofbeats behind Elsie faltered and stopped. "Back off!" Jed's voice cut through the cold air like a knife. "Now." Elsie didn't turn to look, but she heard the Crawford men's horses backing up, snow crunching under their hooves. The silence stretched taut as a wire. "This ain't over, King," one of them called, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "It is for today," Jed answered, his aim never wavering. "Ride out while you still can." More crunching snow, then the sound of retreating horses. Only when their hoofbeats had faded completely did Jed lower his gun. He rode quickly to Elsie's side, his eyes scanning her for injury. "You're hurt," he said, spotting the blood on her sleeve. "Just a graze?" Elsie managed, though her arm was throbbing fiercely now. "The treaty is safe." Without another word, Jed reached across and lifted her smoothly from Daisy's saddle into his own. He wrapped his heavy coat around her, and she sagged against his chest, suddenly aware of how cold and tired she was. Daisy would follow faithfully, he knew. "Hold tight," he said, and spurred his horse toward home. The ride back to the ranch passed in a blur for Elsie. She focused on staying conscious, one hand still pressed protectively over the treaty papers. Jed's arm around her was solid and warm, his horse's steady rhythm carrying them through the gathering dusk. By the time they clattered into the ranch yard, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Clara burst out of the house, took one look at Elsie's pale face and bloody sleeve, and started shouting orders to the gathering ranch hands. "Get her inside by the fire," Clara commanded as Jed lifted Elsie down. "I've got hot broth ready. Someone fetch more blankets." The kitchen was warm and bright, the familiar smells of Clara's cooking filling the air. Elsie sank into the chair by the fire, her fingers trembling as she finally drew out the treaty papers and handed them to Jed. "Not Ani," she said urgently. "She's still at the trapper's cabin. She fell in the creek yesterday. She's sick." Jed took the treaty, quickly checking that it was intact before tucking it safely away. "Tom," he called to one of the hands, "ride for the doctor. Tell him we need him here tonight." To another man he said, "Take 2 more hands and head to the old trapper's cabin. Bring Nat Ani back careful. She's ailing." Clara appeared with a steaming mug of broth, helping Elsie wrap her cold fingers around it. The warmth seemed to seep straight into her bones. Now that her task was done, exhaustion crashed over her in waves. "You did well, girl," Clara said softly, brushing Elsie's hair back from her face. "Drink that down now." Elsie managed a few sips before her eyes grew too heavy to keep open. The last thing she saw was Jed standing guard by the fire, the precious treaty secure in his coat, while Clara fussed with blankets around her shoulders. Then sleep claimed her, deep and dreamless in the safety of her home. Morning sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. Elsie sat straight back beside Jed in the front row, her arm still tender beneath fresh bandages. The treaty papers lay protected in a leather folder on their lawyer's desk, its army seal clearly visible. The courthouse buzzed with whispers and shuffling feet as townspeople packed the benches. Luke Crawford and his lawyers huddled near the front, their faces tight with barely contained anger. The judge, a silver-haired man with sharp eyes, called the session to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. "Present your evidence," he commanded, adjusting his spectacles. Jed's lawyer rose smoothly, the treaty in his hands. "Your Honor, I present the original water rights treaty, properly sealed and signed, establishing clear title to the King Ranch wellspring and surrounding grazing lands." He laid the document before the judge. The courthouse fell silent as the judge examined the papers, turning each page with careful attention. His eyebrows rose at the official seals and signatures. After several long minutes, he looked up, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on the Crawford party. "This document is authentic," he declared. "The supposed deed presented by the railroad's representatives is clearly fraudulent in comparison." He lifted his gavel. "I hereby void the falsified claim and affirm Jedediah King's full rights to the disputed water and grazing lands." The gavel cracked down with finality. A rush of murmurs filled the room. Elsie released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Jed's hand found her shoulder, squeezing gently. But he wasn't finished. Jed stood, his tall frame commanding immediate attention. "Your Honor, if I may address the court?" The judge nodded, curious. "I have another matter to settle today." Jed's voice carried to every corner of the room. "The girl beside me, Elsie May, came to my care through the labor auction. But she's proven herself worth more than any price that could be named." He turned to face the packed courthouse. "I'm declaring my intention to adopt her, legally and properly, as my daughter and heir." The murmurs turned to outright gasps. Elsie's heart seemed to stop, then race forward. She stared up at Jed, hardly daring to believe what she'd heard. "Furthermore," Jed continued, gesturing to where Natani sat wrapped in her blanket near the back, "I want to thank this woman who helped preserve the truth and protect my daughter at great personal risk." He extended his hand to her. "Please join us." Nadani rose with quiet dignity, making her way forward. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but Jed's unwavering stance made his message clear. She was to be honored here. The judge cleared his throat. "The adoption papers can be drawn up immediately if that's your wish, Mr. King." "It is," Jed answered firmly. Luke Crawford and his men stood abruptly, their chair legs scraping against the floor. Without a word, they filed out of the courthouse, defeat evident in every rigid line of their backs. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of signatures and official stamps. By noon, Elsie had a new name, Elsie May King, written in flowing script in the county record book. She traced the letters with trembling fingers, while Jed spoke quietly with the judge about the final details. The ride back to the ranch was different from any before. Elsie sat taller in her saddle, no longer just a charity case or a servant, but a daughter. The winter sun seemed brighter somehow, the familiar trail more welcoming. Jed pointed out boundaries and features of the ranch as they rode, speaking of them now as her inheritance. They could smell Clara's cooking before they even reached the ranch house. Smoke curled invitingly from the chimney, and the sounds of preparation drifted from the open kitchen door. The ranch hands had gathered in their Sunday best, and someone had strung paper decorations across the porch. Clara met them at the door, her usual stern expression softened by a rare smile. "About time you got back," she said, ushering them inside. "The roast's been ready this past hour." The dining room table had been expanded to its full length, every leaf inserted to accommodate the entire ranch family. Steam rose from serving dishes filled with roasted beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and winter vegetables from Clara's root cellar. Natani was given the seat of honor at Jed's right hand, with Elsie on his left. When everyone was seated, Jed rose, lifting his glass. The room fell quiet, all eyes turning to him. The lamplight caught the silver in his hair as he looked around at the gathered faces, ranch hands, Clara, Natriani, and finally Elsie. "I want to set something straight," he said, his deep voice filling the room. "There's been talk about why I bought Elsie at that auction. Some said it was pity." He shook his head. Others thought it was just to spite the Crawfords. His gaze swept the room again. "But here's the truth. I claimed her because she's worth more than this whole valley's gold." Elsie blinked hard, fighting back tears as warmth bloomed in her chest. She'd never felt anything like this sense of belonging, of being truly wanted. "She's proven herself brave," Jed continued. "Loyal and true to what's right. Those are the qualities that make a king." He raised his glass higher. "To my daughter, Elsie May King." "To Elsie!" The room echoed, glasses lifting in response. Clara wiped her eyes quickly with her apron before starting to serve the food. The ranch hands shared stories and laughter, the usual barriers of formality forgotten in the celebration. Natani smiled quietly, accepting seconds of everything Clara offered. Elsie sat in her place beside Jed, taking in the scene around her. The warmth in her chest had spread until it filled her entire being. For the first time in her life, she wasn't an outsider looking in. She was home. Spring crept into the valley like a gentle awakening. The last patches of snow melted away, revealing tender shoots of grass that spread across the pastures in waves of emerald. Near the wellspring that had caused so much strife, cattle grazed peacefully, their coats gleaming in the warm sunlight. Elsie sat proudly astride Daisy, wearing the new riding skirt Jed had specially commissioned for her. The deep blue fabric moved gracefully with each step of her horse as she rode beside her father, surveying their land. The air carried the sweet scent of wild lupines and fresh earth. They followed the familiar trail until they reached the creek where, months ago, Daisy had playfully splashed through the water, drawing Elsie's first real laugh. Jed reined his horse to a stop, looking out over the sparkling water. "You know, Elsie," he said thoughtfully, "this ranch has changed since you came. It's not just the land and cattle anymore." He turned to face her, his expression soft. "You've brought life back to this place, made it a real home again." In town, the changes were just as evident. Merchants who once turned away now greeted her with genuine smiles. Mrs. Peterson at the general store always saved the freshest apples for her, and even the stern-faced banker tipped his hat when she passed. The biggest surprise came one Sunday, when Reverend Matthews approached her after service. "Miss King," he said, his earlier prejudices forgotten, "would you consider reading the scripture next Sunday? You have such a clear, strong voice." Nita became a regular visitor to the ranch, arriving wrapped in her colorful blankets to share stories of Elsie's mother's people. She taught Elsie traditional beadwork and the meanings behind the patterns in her mother's shawl, each lesson weaving together the two halves of Elsie's heritage. One evening, as golden lamplight spilled from the ranch house windows, Elsie sat at the long oak table with Jed and Clara. The savory aroma of Clara's beef stew filled the air as they passed the bread basket and shared stories about their day. Elsie caught herself smiling, realizing how natural it felt now. Not like a guest or a charity case, but like family. Across the table, Jed's eyes crinkled with warmth as he watched her. People still called him the Alpha King, but the title had transformed. Where once it spoke of his dominance over the valley's ranching empire, now it reflected something deeper, his unfailing mercy, and the loyalty that had led him to stand firm when others would have crumbled. "I am not." When he smiled at her from his place at the head of the table, Elsie saw not just her protector or benefactor, but her father, the man who had given her not just a home, but a future filled with purpose and belonging. If today's story echoed in your heart, I hope you'll stick around. Subscribe, and I'll be here again tomorrow with another story that speaks softly but stays deeply.